Hi, Ray. Welcome back to your next lesson on the role of women throughout history. Today is our fourth lesson on women throughout history, and we are focusing on the role that women played in medical discoveries throughout time. So get that down as your title for me, please. The first thing that I want you to consider is think back to last lesson where we were looking at the Salem witch trials, and then the lesson before that as well where we were looking at women, crime and punishment. And just under your title, I'd like you to bullet point for me, please, anything you can remember. What role did women play in medieval medicine and what problems did they face during that time? And if you have forgotten, have a look at this little image here on the right and that might maybe jog your memory. So pause me now, get your title in, and then try to bullet point underneath your title, what role did women play in medieval medicine and what problems did they face? Okay, so hopefully for your focus task, you were able to remember that women did play quite an important role in medicine in medieval times, but it came at a great cost. Women were sometimes accused of witchcraft, or they were sometimes accused of trying to step on the toes of men, and that could be quite problematic for them and their reputation. So moving on, we're going to look at this source. This was written by a woman called Laura Jefferson in a book titled as Women in Medicine, Historical Perspectives and Recent Trends. I'm going to read this source out to you, and then you're going to infer what you can learn from it about women in medicine in modern times. If you've been poorly during your life, chances are that you've probably been treated by a female GP or a female doctor. Women now outnumber men in British medical schools. Over recent years, there has been an increasing discussion of the feminisation of the UK medical workforce, with women now forming the majority of medical students and over half of the GP workforce. This is a relatively new phenomenon, as for centuries, the professions of medicine, like the professions of law, was dominated by men. In this paper that Laura Jefferson wrote, she was going to be examining the history of women in medicine. She's going to review that, and she also looked at the analysis of recent demographic trends and discussions about the consequence of the changing nature of women in the workforce. So, what I would like you to do is, you don't need to focus on this last little bit, really, to be honest. Let's look at this bit here. What I would like you to do is, I would like you to give me 2 things you can infer from this source about the role of women in medicine today. So, just to jog your memory, if you are inferring from a source, that means you are telling me what you can learn. So what can you learn about this source, about the role of women in medicine today? So pause me now and try to get 2 separate pieces of information from this source about what you can learn, what you can infer about the role of women in medicine today. Okay, so hopefully you're able to pick out a couple of different things. What I would have focused on is the number of women that work in medicine today. So it says quite clearly at the start that actually women now outnumber men in British medical schools, and I would have focused on that as one of my first inferences. You could then also have mentioned that this is, it says here, it's a relatively new phenomenon, because actually throughout time, professions such as medicine, similar to law, like if you want to train into be a lawyer or a solicitor, they were always dominated by men. So this new feminisation of the UK medical workforce, this is actually a new thing that we've seen really recently. This isn't something that's been the case over time. So they were a couple of things that I would have got down from my inferences. Okay, next thing, you don't have to set this out like a spider diagram if you don't want to, you can just get these down as bullet points. We're just going to quickly recap the role of women in medicine throughout time before we focus on some of the key women that we're going to research today. So, historically, what was the role of women in medicine? So get this first box here down for me, please. Women were not allowed entry into UK medical schools until the late 19th century. So traditionally, women received no formal education in terms of medical training. So not universities or schools or colleges, that kind of thing. Even though they didn't have a formal training, women were often seen as healers instead. So they were sometimes called a healer, or they were given terms such as wise women or even witches, which, as we saw from the previous lesson, could be extremely problematic if you were deemed to be a negative witch. You could also be called a white witch, where you were seen as having a deeper connection to the world and to the spirits, but you're not a threat, you're a good witch. The reason why women tended to be home healers or be classed as wise women was that women gained their experience and their knowledge of herbal remedies from generation to generation, which is where the term an old wives' tale comes from, or like grandma's recipe or something like that. It's the idea that over time all of the women in the family would have been passed down skills and knowledge that they would then give to their daughter when they gave birth, and so on and so forth. This was skills such as which plants and what herbs to use for illnesses, how to treat a fever, how to treat someone who was vomiting, also ranging from how to wrap an arm or a leg properly if it had been broken, so how to set it. So lots of valuable information tended to be passed down on the female side of the family and not the male side of the family. However, throughout time, the church, predominantly the Roman Catholic Church, but also the Protestant Church, when we see the Reformation in Europe in the 1500s, the church was really heavily involved in discrediting the role of women as healers, and actually to some extent it encouraged witch hunting throughout Europe. If you think back through last lesson as well, we talked about the Salem witch trials, which was created by Puritans who were extreme Protestants. So religion plays a really large role in holding back women in medicine. It comes from sort of the stereotypes in the Bible about what women can and can't do, or what women should and shouldn't do. Education and that kind of thing was seen as a man's job, not a woman's job. A woman's role was in the home. So to be independent and to be out being a healer or someone who had a skillful set of knowledge about plants and herbs, that was seen as treading on the feet of men and was heavily not encouraged. So the church played a really negative role in women in medicine. In fact, it was the church that first passed a law that said that in order to practice legally as a doctor, you had to have a license to do so, and only men could get that license. So it was the church that actually passed that. However, just because women couldn't openly practice in public doesn't mean that they didn't practice at all. So care in the home was really common for women. Women were seen as caregivers. Again, we talked last lesson about the four humours. Women were seen as gentle and soft, that their role as mothers then has an impact on their role, that they should care for their husbands and love them and nurture them. So that then links to the idea that if you've got a crying baby, hand crying baby to mum or to grandma to care for them, because that's naturally, people assume that women are good with that kind of thing. And then finally, midwifery was the only profession in which women were allowed to practice. Midwifery is helping someone give birth if you're a midwife. But the main reason why women were only allowed to practice that really is because traditionally men weren't overly interested in being involved in childbirth. The childbirth was seen as being a community thing. Sorry, I've just noticed we've got a spelling error there. I have to go back and change that. Giving birth was seen as being a community thing where all of the women would pitch in together to help someone give birth. So obviously now people tend to go to hospitals and you're only allowed one or two people there, but sort of in medieval times and Renaissance times you might have your mother there, your sister there, your neighbour there, another woman from down the road there helping you give birth. because the idea was that all of these women all had different skills to help because they'd given birth too. And again, similar to what I mentioned earlier, they passed down knowledge and experience over time to help people give birth. However, this changes slightly when we see the creation of something known as forceps. I imagine you've probably never heard of forceps before, so I'll give you a very brief introduction as to what they are. Forceps are a type of medical equipment that are used to help women give birth if they're having a bit of a tough time or if babies got stuck. And they look like big spoons, basically, and they like clamp on the baby's head and they help pull baby out. I know it sounds absolutely grim. Forceps are still used today. But the thing was, when forceps were invented, when they were created, they were only allowed to be used by men because they were classed as surgical instruments, and women weren't allowed to touch surgical instruments because they weren't allowed to be doctors. So what we see is, with the creation of new technology, the number of female midwives reduces over time, because there was this presumption that because men had more access to medical equipment like forceps, that therefore men had much more skills at helping women to give birth. Actually, that wasn't true. What you see is, with the introduction of more medical equipment such as forceps, that then leads to a higher risk of the woman getting infected with something once she's given birth, because it can make birth a little bit more traumatic if you introduce equipment to it. And during these times, they didn't have any treatments or any cures for infections. So what we actually see is, once men start to get involved in midwifery and once men start to create all these new contraptions and all these new medical equipment, actually the death rate of women giving birth and the death rate of newborn babies does actually increase during this time. So today we are going to research 3 key women in medical history. Now, there are so many more women that I could have picked, and I do feel a little bit guilty that I've left some key women out, but obviously we can't look at them all in just this short space of time, so I've just picked 3. What you're going to do is you're going to record what their contribution to medicine was, you're going to record any issues they faced, and then you're going to write a judgment. Do you think that this woman was held back by society? If so, why? Or were they actively encouraged within their field? So I'm going to put this sheet on Teams here, so you can fill out this table where you would write the person that you're writing about, their achievements in medicine, any issues they faced, and then your own personal judgment. Was she held back by society? If so, why? So have your sheet up in front of you. If you don't want to use the sheet, then obviously just write freehand, or you could draw it. It's totally up to you. So I'm going to read the information out to you, and then I want you to pause me and then go back to your table and fill in the sections for me, please. So the first woman we are looking at is Florence Nightingale. Florence was born into a wealthy family in 1820. When she was young, she was allowed to visit poor people when they were sick in the local area where she lived. Here she saw real poverty and a desperate need for help. Nursing, she decided, was the answer. She made this decision in 1844, but it took a further 7 years before she could convince her parents to agree with her and to give her their permission. So she had to have permission off her parents first before she was allowed to train as a nurse. In 1851, she was finally allowed to go for training in Germany. Her mother was very ashamed of her daughter's job. At this time, nursing was not a respectable job. Nurses were poorly paid, they had little training, they're often described as being dog's bodies. A dog's body is not a very nice word. It's often referred to somebody as, if you're someone's dog body, you kind of run around after them, you're not important, you're just sort of there to look after more important people. Whilst training, Florence saw a complete lack of reliable trained nurses. She visited the London hospitals and studied the conditions there. She was convinced that there was a desperate need for trained nurses. So during this point, you didn't have to have specific training to become a nurse, whereas now you have to go to university and get a degree within nursing. Back then you didn't have to do that, and Florence thought this was a real problem. In 1854, the Crimean War broke out. The British military hospital in Scutari in Turkey was swamped by a flood of wounded men. Conditions were dreadful. They had blocked sewers, no trained nurses, no blankets, no bandages. And the wounded soldiers were dying like flies. As soon as they got to the hospital, they were getting sicker and sicker, and they were dying really quickly. The cabinet minister responsible for the conditions in the army was a guy called Sidney Herbert, and he was a personal friend of the Nightingale family, and he knew Florence Nightingale's dad. He wrote to Florence and asked for her help because he knew that she had been taking part in nursing training. Florence agreed to help, and she took 14 trained nurses with hospital experience to Scutari. Once she arrived, the death rate in the hospital fell from 40% to 2% in just the 2 years that they were there. That's how much of a positive impact they'd had. The wounded soldiers and the public at home put the whole of this improvement down to the work of Florence and her trained nurses. On her return to England after the war, Florence was given £44,000 to set up a Nightingale School of Nurses. The Nightingale School at St Thomas's Hospital in London created the modern nursing profession that we know today. She started the stepping stones towards modern nursing that we have now. It started in 1860 with just 15 student nurses, but by 1901 there were in Britain 2,000 student nurses, 3,170 trained nurses in hospitals, and many thousands of others working in nursing homes. In 1859, Nightingale published a book called Her Notes on Nursing, and this set down the training that nurses should receive. Her ideas had influence well into the 20th century. So pause me now, go back to your table, note down, pop it up here, achievements in medicine. What did Florence achieve? What did she do? Any issues she faced? And then judgment. Do you think she was held back by society during this time, or do you think she was supported and she was helped? You can have a mixture. You don't have to have a complete yes or no. So there might be some evidence to suggest that in some respects she was held back, but then in other respects she wasn't. Don't just put yes or no, make sure you explain. Number 2, Mary Seacole. Mary Seacole was born in Jamaica more than 200 years ago. During this period, many black people in the Caribbean were forced to work as slaves, and although Mary's mother was black, her father, James Grant, was a white Scottish army officer, so therefore Mary was born a free person and wasn't born as a slave. Mary's mother ran a lodging house, which was much respected by local people in Kingston, which is Jamaica's capital city. But she was also a healer, and she taught Mary many of her skills using traditional Jamaican medicines. A keen student from early childhood, Mary practiced medicine on dogs, cats, and also practiced on herself. By 1818, aged 12, Mary helped to run the boarding house with her mum. Many of the guests there were either sick or injured soldiers who needed help. 3 years later, she travelled to England and stayed for about a year. She used this as an opportunity to acquire knowledge about modern European medicines, which then supplemented her training in traditional Caribbean techniques, so they kind of went hand in hand, so she was getting the best of both worlds, really. In 1823, Mary went to London. It was in London where she experienced racist comments. She described herself as only a little brown, but she was there with a friend who had much darker skin, so a lot of the boys in London made fun of the colour of their skin because they looked different and they treated them differently. In 1850, she nursed victims of the Kingston cholera epidemic, and then she travelled to Panama in 1851 to find that her skills were needed again because that area was also suffering from its own outbreak of the disease. Cholera was or still is because you can still get cholera, is a really serious illness that you catch through drinking dirty water, and it can kill a healthy person within 24 hours. So her work was desperately needed, and she did help people with cholera. This is when Mary Seacole and Florence Nightingale have a bit of a crossover. When the Crimean War broke out, Mary travelled to England and approached the British War Office asking to be sent as an army nurse, but she was completely refused, probably because she was black and she was a woman. So she funded her own trip to Crimea, where she established something known as the British Hotel. The hotel provided a place of respite for sick and recovering soldiers. At the time, Mary was as well known in Britain as Florence Nightingale. Nightingale's famous hospital was situated hundreds of miles from the front line in Scutari, but Mary's hotel was much closer to the fighting. Mary was able to visit the battlefield, sometimes under fire, so risking herself, to go and nurse the wounded soldiers and try to get them back to the hotel to treat them. After the war, she returned to Britain with no money, and I think this is probably the saddest part about the story of Mary Seacole. So she went back to Britain with no money, and she just wasn't celebrated in the same way that Florence Nightingale was, again, probably because she was black. Mary would not be remembered for another 100 years until nurses from the Caribbean came over to Britain and they visited her grave in northwest London, and they petitioned for a statue to be made in her honour, which was eventually created in 2016 in the grounds of St Thomas's Hospital in London. So similar stories in the sense that Nightingale and Seacole ended up effectively working in the same war in the same way, but actually they do have quite a few strong differences in their experiences of being women in medicine. So same again, person, Mary Seacole, achievements in medicine, issues, and then judgment. Was she held back by society, or was she promoted within medicine? And if so, why? Last one, obviously feel free to pause me if I'm going too quick. Rosalind Franklin. This name should ring a bell because actually Franklin is one of our school houses, although it does surprise me whenever I mention this in school just how few students know that Franklin of our school is this woman, which again I think says a lot about the role of women in medicine. Franklin was born in July 1920 in London to a wealthy Jewish family who really valued education. At the age of 18, she enrolled in the Women's College at Cambridge University, where she studied physics and chemistry. After Cambridge, she went to work for the British Coal Utilisation Research Association, where she gained her PhD. In 1964, Franklin moved to Paris, where she perfected her skills in X-ray crystallography, which would become her life's work. This is important, this key term here. I might just pop that in red, actually, because this plays a really important role in the story later on. So she becomes an expert in a specific type of X-ray. It's not just a regular X-ray, what we might have if we break a finger or our arm or whatever. This is a really in-depth, brand new, top-of-the-range type of X-ray machine. She returned after 4 years to London and accepted a job at King's College. Now, slightly different with the other two women, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the work of some men in Rosalind Franklin's story, because they play a very important role in Rosalind Franklin's journey in medicine. So, I need to introduce you to two gentlemen. First of all, we have Francis Crick, who had trained as a physicist and then went to look at molecular biology and genetics. And then secondly, James Watson, who went to Chicago University at the age of 15. Both had been experts in their area, and these two men were prepared to work in different areas of science to get the answers they desperately wanted about DNA. Most importantly, what they needed to know was what the structure of DNA was. Because what DNA looked like and its structure held the secret to explaining how DNA worked. So during this time period, it was generally accepted by scientists that DNA controlled our bodies and the way we look and the way a lot to do with how healthy we are and the way we're born, that kind of thing. They accepted that, but what they didn't know was what DNA looked like, and you need to understand what it looks like in order to understand how it works. So Crick and Watson were stuck. They knew what DNA was, but they didn't know what it looked like, so they couldn't get any further. And this is where Franklin comes back in. A team at King's College in London had for several years been doing experiments using a relatively new technique of X-ray crystallography, which I mentioned earlier. One of them was Rosalind Franklin because, as we know, she was an expert in X-ray crystallography. It was actually Rosalind Franklin that took the now famous image of an X-ray pattern of DNA showing a clear cross shape. I should probably have put that picture on there for you to see, but I can't now. But if you don't know what DNA looks like, it's like a cross, but it's a twisted cross. It's known as a double helix. She photographed it first using her X-ray crystallography machine, so it was her that discovered the structure of it. She had discovered the structure of DNA, but Franklin's colleague, who actually they weren't really getting on during this time, Franklin's colleague Maurice Wilkins, had become a really close friend of the two boys that I mentioned earlier, Watson and Crick. Maurice Wilkins stole Franklin's X-ray crystallography image of the structure of DNA and took it to meet up with the boys, and he let James Watson see the image, but he didn't tell Franklin that he'd done that, so he stole her image and took it to the boys. Using Franklin's photograph, Watson and Crick created their famous DNA model. Franklin's contribution was not even acknowledged. Rosalind Franklin made a crucial contribution to the discovery of double helix structure of DNA, but she really got the raw end of the deal. Franklin is in the shadows of science history, for while her work on DNA was crucial to the discovery of its structure, her contribution to that landmark of discovery is little known, really. And what's the most saddest part about this story, I think, is that Francis Crick, James Watson and Maurice Wilkins were awarded a Nobel Peace Prize for their discovery of the structure of DNA, and Rosalind Franklin was never nominated. So they stole her picture, they used her picture to produce their work on DNA, and she never got any credit for it. Bad crack, boys. So last one, person, achievements in medicine, issue and judgment. Was she held back by society? So now you should have 3 individual judgments on Florence Nightingale, Mary Seacole and Rosalind Franklin. And you can use those judgments to think generally, in what ways do you think women were held back in medicine in particular? When I know we talked about earlier about the role of the church and the role of religion, but even so, with Rosalind Franklin, for example, we're talking about the mid-1900s, where the role of religion has massively decreased during that time. So you can't really blame the role of religion on her treatment. So overall, what do you think? Do you think women in medicine were held back throughout time? The judgment is up to you. Thanks for listening again, and I'll speak to you again later.